In today's lesson, you're going to learn how to locate fractions and decimals on a number line. So we're going to work on a number line. You're already familiar with that. And we want to put fractions, things like 1/2 and 2 1/3, 3/5, as well as decimals, things like 0 and 4/10, or 0 and 15/100 on the number line. You should already be kind of familiar with a number line that shows the whole numbers. I mean, after 0, we've got 1, 2, 3, and all the other numbers going out to infinity. And you may even be familiar with a number line that shows negative numbers like -1 and -2. We'll focus more on the negative numbers at a later time. Right now we're going to focus on all of the numbers that are in between these whole numbers and their negative opposites. So like all the distance from 0 to 1, we can put all kinds of numbers in there, fractions and decimals. And same thing in between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, and so on. Now, when I take this number line that goes from 0 to 1, and I divide the distance in between 0 and 1 into two equal parts, right in the middle, I've now created halves. So in that distance, I'm showing the fraction 1/2, 1 out of 2. Remember, the numerator tells me how many pieces I have. So at this space, I have 1 piece. And the denominator tells me how many the whole is, and in this case the whole is 2. So this fraction is 1/2 right in the middle, and you already know that 1 whole is also represented by any number over itself. So 1 whole is equal to 2 halves, which makes sense because I've got 2 pieces to make a whole. So if we return to the number line we started out with, I can see that I can make halves where all of these red lines are. So in between all the whole numbers are the halves. So we already know about 1/2, and here's 1 and 1/2. Then we've got 2 and 1/2, and 3 and 1/2. And you should also remember that there are names for all of those numbers that are bigger than 1 as improper fractions. So 1/2 is the same thing as 3 halves. And if you need a reminder, that's because to get to 3 halves, we have 1/2, 2 halves, and 3 halves. And 2 and 1/2 is the same thing as 5 halves. And 3 and 1/2 is the same thing as 7 halves. This even works for the negative numbers. So in between 0 and -1 is -1/2. And in between -1 and -2 is -1 and 1/2. And we're going to work a lot more with those later. Alright, so what happens if I divide my distance from 0 to 1 into 3 parts, 3 equal parts? Well, these parts are going to be called thirds. Thirds, because it takes 3 to make a whole. And the first one is 1/3, the second one is 2/3, and the third one, or 1 whole, is 3/3. And we remember that that's, of course, a 1 in disguise. And if I take this distance from 0 to 1 and I divide it into 4 parts, and I like to do that by first dividing it into halves, and then divide each of the halves into half. So now I've got 4 parts. I've of course made fourths, so I've got 1/4, 2/4, which is the same thing as 1/2, 3/4, and 4/4, which is 1 whole. Alright, let's put that all together on a number line from 0, and then we've got 1, here's 2, and 3 is over here right where the arrow is. Let's see if we can put some fractions on this number line. Now I know all of the halves are exactly in between the whole numbers. So there's 1/2. And then in between 1 and 2 is 1 and 1/2. And in between 2 and 3 is 2 and 1/2. And then I get thirds by dividing all of the whole numbers, the distances in between, into 3 equal parts. So I'm going to have thirds there and there. That's 1/3, and there's 2/3. And then I've got, after 1, I've got thirds there and there. So that's 1 and 1/3, and there's 1 and 2/3. And then after 2, I've got thirds here and here. And that's going to be 2 and 1/3. And here's 2 and 2/3. I get the fourths by dividing each of the distances into 4 equal parts. So, and I'll do that up above. So first I divide in half, and then I divide the half in half. So there's that, and then the other half in half. And so right here is 1/4. This is 2/4. Here's 3/4. And of course 4/4 is right there at the whole. And then after 1 whole, again, I'll divide that distance into fourths again. I've got 1 and 1/4. Here's 1 and 2/4, but usually we call that 1 and 1/2. And then here's 1 and 3/4. And then after 2, I've got, again, I'm going to divide this into fourths. There's 2 and 1/4. Here's 2 and 2/4. And here's 2 and 3/4. So we've taken all those whole numbers and we put a ton of fractions on those, which is, of course, swell. But we could definitely, if we wanted to, put a ton of other fractions in there. Fractions like 1/5, or fifths, which would be the whole distance divided into 5 equal parts, or we could put tenths, which would be the distance divided into 10 equal parts, or even hundredths, thousandths. We could put any fraction that we think of on this number line, which is again why I think it's swell.